Hello true believers. Welcome back to the second part of my coverage of the Annihilation Screw Sentry event. In the first part we have covered the events of the entire event. I had certain thoughts during certain scenes, but I tried to keep those thoughts out of the first video, to keep everything more focused and structured. I believe that focus and a good structure are very important when it comes to telling stories. I also believe that Marvel struggles to implement that focus and that structure to a character like the Sentry. Certain writers like Paul Jenkins, Donny Cates and Jeff Lemire were able to pull it off, but as soon as less talented and less invested writers get to work on the Sentry, that character's potential quickly starts falling apart. To lead with an example and provide a good structure, this second part of the event coverage will be divided into 3 pieces. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Let us begin with all the good parts. What positively surprised me was the amount of panel time the Sentry had in this event. It was pretty much his event, and it started off months ago in Black Panther and the Agents of Wakanda Forever, when the merged Sentry returned. He was struggling with his dark side and twisting reality in process. The Agents of Wakanda Forever were fighting an uphill battle, but somehow still managed to extract the negative energy from the Sentry and calm him down. He flew off into space and Marvel left us with the notion that he would soon return. The Sentry did return shortly after and set something in motion, which led to the start of the Annihilation Screw Sentry event. Throughout the event, Sentry appeared in every single one of the 6 issues. So if you are a Sentry fan, you got a lot of reading material out of it. It was also nice to see that Marvel keeps viewing the Sentry as a force of nature, whose power dwarfs everyone around him. The Sentry has been an event boss multiple times already. While that now maybe sounds like simple power level wanking, I assure you that it is not. I like the fact that Sentry is consistently being portrayed as a god amongst mortal men and women for another reason, which I'll get into during the upcoming ugly part. Another good thing however was the ending, where Sentry went back to his new status quo as the new merged Sentry. He didn't get killed off. He didn't get locked into a god prison with the god key being thrown away. He stayed in the negative zone to protect that universe, so there is always an easy way for him to return to the regular Marvel universe, if a writer decides to do something with him. The last good thing about Sentry's characterization in the event were certain issues where Sentry was portrayed fairly well. Especially the Silver Surfer one, where I could see a little bit of Paul Jenkins' Sentry influence. The way Bob was portrayed and handled himself reminded me of the superb first Sentry volume, which is until this day my all-time favorite comic book. If you haven't read it, then you absolutely should. But that leads us to the bad parts. While there were 1 or 2 issues where Sentry was portrayed well, there were also others which didn't manage to capture the essence of the Sentry. There is an old saying which states that too many cooks spoil the broth, and that was certainly the case during this event. This event had multiple writers, and while you might not notice that in the individual issues, where the main focus lies on the various characters, you do notice it extremely when you pay attention to the Sentry. Sentry's portrayal was all over the place. In the first issue he sounded like a recurring, mustache-twirling Saturday morning cartoon villain. Absolutely comical. And in the issue with Beta Male Bill, Sentry sounded like Dude Bro Chadman. As if he had no time to waste on Bill, since he had to hit the gym. And then, in the next issue he sounded like a calm and collected badass, which at times does fit the Sentry well, but the dialogue was way off. In the Nova issue, Sentry, well, actually the Void, was talking about how calling him bad is way too simplistic. And that he is beyond simple concepts such as good and bad. That is a problem. It is a problem because it not only goes against everything the Sentry has been about for almost 2 decades, but because it also contradicts Sentry's statements about himself in a later issue. A big part of Sentry's being was always about his duality, about all the good he represents as the Sentry and all the bad he represents as the Void. The Void is the opposite of the Sentry. If the Sentry is good, then the Void is bad. If the Sentry is lawful, then the Void is chaotic. And that is what the Sentry later on says about the Void. Sentry states that Void wants chaos. What the Void talks about in this panel kinda hints at a blue and orange morality. That is a trope, which stands for beings that are far beyond simple concepts such as good and evil. Beings, which other beings cannot even comprehend. That is something which often gets talked about in Lovecraftian cosmic horror stories. In those stories of being like, actually, I'm not even going to write this word down, since the text-to-speech program is sure as shit not going to pronounce it correctly. Instead, I'm going to show you a picture of the winged humanoid octopus I'm talking about. This guy here is not necessarily evil. He just is. We might view some of the things he does as evil, but to him, he just does. That is also what the void implies here. And I get where the writer was going with this, with the eldritch abominations from the Cancerverse and their wish to just do, but it still does not go hand in hand with what the Sentry and the void are, and what the actions of the void are in this very event. And I find all of that to be very unfortunate. One of the reasons I like the Sentry is his unfathomable power to warp reality with his mind. The way the Sentry has been portrayed for a very long time, it can be said that he is a regular guy who has power beyond his own comprehension. Long time ago I was hoping to get a story about the Sentry and his fight against the many-angled ones, which are Lovecraftian horrors in the Marvel universe. One of the residents of the Negative Zone even calls the Sentry a many-angled one, so writers clearly see and think about the same themes, but these are never explored in detail. Another bad thing was the obvious disregard for Sentry's continuity. In the first part I've already talked about how the Negative Zone weakens the Sentry and empowers the void. That is how Robert Reynolds views it, and that is what happens. Obviously and ultimately, if Bob wanted the Sentry to absorb negative energy and become stronger that way, that is what would happen. But Bob views the Sentry as his good and positive persona and the void as his bad and negative persona. So the negative persona is the one which will get empowered by the negative energy of that particular universe. And in this event we had Reed Richards send the Sentry into the Negative Zone to get rid of the void, even though, if we go by the established lore, the Negative Zone would have made the void even stronger and given the Sentry less of a fighting chance. And now we have the Sentry staying in the Negative Zone, where void should more or less be gaining more and more control over time. Or at least that's how it should be. It is only a minor gripe of mine, because in the end of the day, Marvel can easily say that Sentry's new merged state allowed him to harness the negative energy of the Negative Zone for himself. My actual gripe with this part is that nothing has been resolved for the Sentry. He is still at the same spot he has been at the beginning of Black Panther and the Agents of Wakanda Forever. So the next time we see the Sentry, he will probably still be struggling with the void. Which leads us to the last part. The ugly part. I do not believe that the guys and gals over at Marvel are capable of coming up with one single sentence including the word Sentry without having the word void in there as well. Now listen. I love the void. I believe that void is a very key element when it comes to the Sentry as a character. But enough is enough. It's crazy how much untapped potential the Sentry has as a character. Allow me to pull a couple of things out of my butt which you could do with the Sentry without including the void. Let me think. 1. The Sentry is a fairly unique character on Marvel Earth when it comes to power level. There is pretty much no other character on his level who can do the things he can do. In the DC universe you have Superman, but at the same time you have a bunch of other Kryptonians, and you have multiple Flashes, multiple Shazams, and so on. All these characters can travel across the globe at any given moment in time. They can fly into every country and save every person. In the Marvel universe that is different. Someone in Saudi Arabia has no fucking idea who Spider-Man is. So in the case of an upcoming car accident, that man or woman who is about to get hit by an approaching car will not get saved by Spider-Man. But he or she might get saved by Sentry. Sentry has the senses to hear it, and he has the speed to intervene. Sentry can be everywhere on the planet at any given moment. Sentry does not need to sleep or eat. He can save people day in and day out, every single minute and second of the day. That is something he has been doing in the past and that is something which has given him problems. It was simply too much never-ending responsibility for a single sane person to deal with. Unfortunately, that has only been mentioned in bias. That however canon should be explored further. Use Sentry to show what it would be like to be Superman in the real world. Superman is portrayed as this hopeful and inspiring character, but every smart and sane person knows that all of that is just wishful thinking. Everyone knows how cruel the world can be and how quickly a character like Superman would go insane if he tried to do what we expect him to do. 2. Let the sentry be the scapegoat for the twisted and evil nature of humans. What would happen if the sentry was real and tried to save the world? Think about it and make a comic about it. Again, no one gives a shit about Spider-Man, who is by the way not only my second favorite superhero, but my second favorite fictional character in general. Spider-Man's power level and his area of responsibility are tiny when compared to the sentry. The sentry can be seen everywhere. He can be needed and admired by everyone. Whatever the sentry says reaches so many people, so he wouldn't be allowed to say anything. Sentry wouldn't be allowed to say that Nickelback is his favorite band. That band would become the most popular band on the planet. They would get publicity like no other. Their sales would go through the roof. And they might get killed by people who hate the sentry and everything he likes. Then you would have the people who love the sentry and would jump off rooftops while calling to him to save them. And then they would hit the floor and explore. Because if he did save them, they would jump again. And they would tell their friends. Sentry would never be allowed to show his ability to heal and resurrect other people. People on the farthest possible right would take hostages and try to force the sentry to resurrect Hitler. Desperate mothers and fathers would do desperate things in order to force the sentry to resurrect their dead children. 3. Sentry has an extensive and colorful rogue gallery, which I have covered in another video. All of them have very unestablished backstories due to the little panel time they had, but the groundwork has been laid out. Some of his opponents like Cranio, Scout, and Gorax have almost as much potential as the sentry. A gifted writer could dive deep and create an entire universe centered around the sentry, the same we got with Spider-Man, Batman and so on. Sentry stories write themselves, yet we constantly have to deal with the void. 4. The sentry is mentally ill. He is a paranoid schizophrenic and suffers from generalized anxiety disorder. Back in the day he also had to deal with agoraphobia, but it appears as if he has gotten over that during the events of Uncanny Avengers. His paranoid schizophrenia makes it so that he sees and hears things which are not really there, but due to the way his powers work, he makes those things real, and those things appear in the form of the void. His generalized anxiety disorder makes it so that he constantly worries about everything. He worries about what other people might demand from him if he used some of his more exotic powers, and he worries about what happens in general when he uses his powers at all. And I don't think it's too crazy to say that he struggles with depression every now and then. At this point it strikes me as if Marvel has completely forgotten about Sentry's mental illnesses. I honestly do not believe that they still remember. To me it looks like as if they view him as Marvel's Superman with a dark side, which is something so many hack news outlets call the Sentry, and it pisses me off every single time because it takes away so much away from the Sentry as a character. But slowly and surely, I'm starting to see it. That however is a gigantic missed opportunity, since it leaves a big target demographic hanging. No matter what your skin color, sexual orientation or religion is, you are not safe from a mental illness. Yet Marvel has been mainly focusing on identity politics for years now. We are stuck with badly written characters, whose main selling points are their skin color, their sexual orientation and their religion. What I want are characters who get beat down by their opponents, and by society, by absolutely everyone and everything, and who still manage to stand up and fight for what's right and more importantly for themselves. The Sentry is such a character. Back in the day, when Paul Jenkins was writing the Sentry, a lot of hidden undertones of the Sentry were about how society ignores people with mental illness. That's what all of Sentry's mind wiping was all about. And the Joker movie had a great quote, which perfectly encapsulates the problem people with mental illness have. It states that, if you have a mental illness, other people expect you to behave as if you don't. That is very true. Trust me, I speak from experience. People expect you to be a certain way, and if you aren't, they ignore you, and they leave you. That has again happened to the Sentry in the recent event. He is sent to a strange universe, and is in the end left there to deal with his problems on his own. And when he comes back, I expect him to be on his own again. Without a supporting cast. Without friends to help him out. Without professionals to take care of him. Without a love interest to make his days brighter. He will once again be reduced to a crazy person who needs to be taken care of quickly so that the healthy rest of the universe can go on with their day. But Marvel should do the opposite and focus on the struggle of mentally ill person, even if it can be ugly at times. Show the ugly truth, but also show that it's not a choice and that it's something which most of the time cannot be dealt with on one's own. And I could go on and on. But hey, I'm not stupid. While I do hope that you agree with me on some of the stuff I propose, we both know that executing and establishing all of that needs to make money, requires money, and also requires editors and writers who are willing to green light and write good stories about good characters. The Sentry is not going to make as much money as Spider-Man or Venom. That's simply never going to happen. And if you are not in that position, you are much less likely to get the budget greenlit for your potentially amazing stories to be told. Then we also have the current generation of editors and writers at Marvel, who mostly seem to be interested in telling stories about identity politics, even though most of these characters have been selling less comics than the Sentry, even though they have been promoted more. I don't care from which generation you are. No matter if you're 45 years, or 30 years, or 15 years old. If you love Marvel comics, you most likely love them due to the way Marvel used to portray their heroes. In the DC universe, everyone is an inspiring beacon of hope. No one has real flaws. In the Marvel universe, everyone and their mother is flawed. In an interview with Wolverine's co-creator Len Wein, it was stated that the Marvel universe is just a bunch of flawed people hanging around and trying to do the right thing. And that describes characters like Wolverine, Spider-Man, the Hulk, and ultimately the Sentry perfectly. These characters make you feel for them. SJW character number 108, who is better and smarter than everyone else, and is loved and encouraged by everyone, does not. Let us end on that note. Thank you for your time. Have a nice day, and as always, stay vigilant.